I want to welcome you to this evening's debate concerning academic freedom and institutional autonomy. My name is Linda Jillison, and while I'm a professor of classics in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures, I welcome you tonight in my capacity as some kind of editor, co-editor of the Montana Professor. Tonight's debate opportunity, having come our way because of our work with Ms. Neal and Dr. Bowen in the construction of the fall issue of our journal, which some of you may have seen. My particular honor and pleasure tonight is to introduce to you Professor George Dennison. President Dennison is not only the leader of the 4 campuses of the University of Montana, Missoula system, but also the generous sponsor of this event. When it seemed like a debate here on campus on this critical issue about the future of American higher education might be possible, President Dennison immediately urged us to go forward with our plans. And he has supported those plans at every step of the way with his characteristic generosity. Thank you very much, President Dennison. This was in his function as university president. President Dennison has also served, however, along with President Gamble of Montana State University in Bozeman, as guest editor of the Montana Professor for this year. And in that capacity, he has agreed to moderate this evening's discussion between Ms. Ann Neal and Dr. Roger Bowen. I am honored then to present President Dennison, who will introduce our visitors and give you some information about the format of tonight's discussion. President Dennison.
Thanks very much, Linda, and I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Linda Jillison and Dick Walton for the work that they've done behind the scenes. They're the real editors of the Montana Professor. Some of us get to be on the masthead, so to speak, but they get to do the work. And so a round of applause for those two. I think it was about 1.5 years ago that Dick Walton suggested that it might be time to dedicate an issue or 2 issues of the Montana Professor to what has increasingly become a critical issue in the United States, and that's the future of higher education. Primarily, the focus would be on public higher education, but we should talk about higher education in general. And we should think about the stakeholders who are involved, not just the faculty and the students, administrators and staff, but the general public. And why do we have public higher education? What is its role? What are its responsibilities? What are the tensions involved? And how do we assure that it remains on track? Unless we have, as he said, dialogue about the issues. And that brings us tonight, I believe, to what will be a dialogue between 2 very qualified and eminent persons to speak to these issues about academic freedom and institutional autonomy and how those 2 fit together. First, a few comments about the format. We will begin with comments from each of our panelists, and then each will have an opportunity to respond to the other. And at that point, we will expect you to become involved so that this becomes a much broader dialogue than just between these 2. But I can assure you that based upon their contributions in the fall and what I know about their engagements in other venues, that they will indeed raise the issues, they will spark some excitement, and they will generate some continuing discussion if you are alive out there, and I assume that you are.
If we are alive, yeah.
We also have 2 microphones, and so if you are able and you would walk to the microphone, please do. If, on the other hand, you would prefer to have the microphone delivered to you, just raise your hand, and we have a runner named Charles. Where's Charles? Over here. And he's in good shape physically, and he will be happy to run a microphone to whomever needs it, except Professor Drake. who must walk to the microphone.
He needs exercise.
He needs exercise. So that's the format. And let me now say a few words to introduce our distinguished panelists. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And with no further ado, then they will begin, and we will proceed right on through. Our first speaker will be Roger Bowen, over to my far right, appropriately so. Took office as General Secretary of the American Association of University Professors in July 2004. Before he came to Washington, he served as president and CEO of the Milwaukee Public Museum, but before that, he was a president of an institution, a vice president for academic affairs, professor of international affairs, many other roles such as that in higher education, including directing a campus abroad, Colby in Cork, a campus we know fairly well here. And since 1981, he has been an associate in research at the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard University. That gives you a glimpse of his background. His baccalaureate came from Wabash College in Indiana. I won't mention the date because he prefers to be younger than he is. A master's degree in Michigan, and then a doctoral degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. And he is a scholar of Japan and focuses on democracy and the development of Japanese democracy. He's traveled extensively abroad. He's served on various public boards. He has been awarded any number of prestigious awards for his service to higher education and to the issues we're talking about this evening. For example, he has the Michael John Award for his defense of academic freedom in 1999 from the AAUP. Dr. Bowen will lead off our talk. Our second speaker is Ann D. Neal, who currently serves as president and board member of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, a national education nonprofit dedicated to academic freedom, academic excellence, and accountability. Three terms that have become very prominent in today's discussions. That organization was created in '95. Ms. Neal graduated from Harvard College, magna cum laude, in 1977 with a degree in American history. Following that, she was a journalist for a while until she learned better, and then went back to law school and received her JD from Harvard Law School. And while there, she was the first female editor of the Harvard Journal on Legislation, and was admitted to practice in Washington, D.C., Wisconsin, and New York, where she is currently, but she's currently inactive. From 1980 to 82, she was a First Amendment lawyer at the New York law firm of Rogers & Wells, where she represented Newsweek and Associated Press. She has had several such engagements over the years, including senior counsel or policy advisor for the National Endowment for the Humanities and general counsel of the Office of Administration, the Executive Office of the President from 1982 to 84. Her experience in cultural and civic organizations is well known. She serves on the Founders Committee for Historic Mount Vernon. One of her most, I think, interesting and perhaps well-known publications was a book that she published as a co-author or primary author in 2000, Losing America's Memory, Historical Literacy in the 21st Century. It's memorable to me because of the people who have commented about it. David Broder is one of my favorite columnists, and David McCulloch, one of my favorite historians. Very, I think, people with very good judgment. These are our speakers tonight. These are two people whom I have seen in various occasions engaging this issue, and I'm sure that we're in for a very rich dialogue this evening. So without further ado, would you welcome our speakers this evening.
It's my task, can you hear me all right? This is working? To begin, I propose the subject matter, the topic for tonight's discussion, debate. I'm not sure why, but it certainly came out of the piece that I did for the Montana professor, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read that, and Anne's very capable article on the same issue. But I too would like to begin by thanking Linda for a wonderful job in putting this together. Thank President Dennison for agreeing to moderate and for sponsoring this event and encouraging this dialogue. I think it is an important dialogue. And certainly Dick Walton for his yeoman service. I started to say yo person, but I'm around Ann, so I could say yeoman and get away with it.
Right, that's right.
You know, and it's appropriate in a way for AAUP to be represented here at the University of Montana. Our history goes back to 1915 when we were founded by John Dewey, but it's frequently forgotten that we were founded in March, and in June of 1915, one of the first calls we received was from the University of Montana. After the president, one dean, and 2 faculty had been summarily fired by the governing board. John Dewey brought this to the attention of Arthur Lovejoy, a philosopher at Johns Hopkins and also one of our founders, and said, we got to get somebody out to Montana right away and investigate this. This is an abomination. But AAUP was brand new, had little in the way of resources, and there was a crisis of equal importance, so they judged, at University of Utah. So instead of University of Montana being our first official investigation, it was University of Utah. We had a choice between those 2 schools in Stanford, and we wound up in Utah. I regret that. I would like to have learned more about the dismissal of the president. I'm sure President Dennison would as well. How can this happen? AAUP and ACTA, Ann's organization, no secret, have been at battle for the last several years. I think it antedates my arrival at AAUP, but it's a significant battle because the stakes are so great. ACTA, American Council of Trustees and Alumni, from our perspective, is a Johnny-come-lately. Formed in 1995 by Lynn Cheney, who had a very conservative agenda. People on the board like Ed Meese, former Attorney General in the Reagan administration, funded by some of the most conservative foundations in America. A lot of money. AAUP, supported by faculty across the country. We have 45,000 dues-paying members who support our work on behalf of 1.1 million faculty. And we do help all faculty, and we never ask whether they're members or not. Why do we help faculty? Because we think academic freedom is precious, and we think academic freedom is under fire, even under fire, from those who pretend to defend and protect it. And I do not discount in any way Ann Neal's desire, or ACTA's desire, to defend academic freedom. I see them as a sincere, well-intentioned group, albeit ideologically conservative. I see them as an advocacy group on the behalf of conservative causes. AAUP, on the other hand, we like to believe, transcends ideological differences. We never ask a faculty member when they come to us for help, are you a conservative or a progressive or a liberal? We never ask, are you a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? That's inappropriate. We help faculty regardless of their ideological inclinations or their party membership. Those issues are insignificant in our judgment. I do not think, in the case of ACTA, that those issues are insignificant. So I'd like to begin trying to find common ground. And I think I've identified 7 areas where I think ACTA and the AAUP share basic values and similar interests. And then I'll identify 4 areas where I think we part company rather significantly. First, ACTA, I'm happy to say, like AAUP, strongly rejects David Horowitz's Academic Bill of Rights and the attempt to bring legislation outside federal or governmental control over the academy. Bad idea. Secondly, ACTA, like AAUP, believes that the academy without academic freedom is not the academy at all. It is a perversion of higher education. That the academy, because it does have academic freedom, produces great new ideas, exciting classes, faculty who are engaged and giving back to the community in important ways. Third, ACTA and the AAUP believes that speech codes on campuses are a terrible idea. We issued a major policy statement denouncing speech codes back in 1991. ACTA, again, formed somewhat later, joins us in that regard in thinking speech codes are a violation of First Amendment rights and probably undermines academic freedom. Fourth, both organizations believe that students have a right to learn, an important right to learn, a right, indeed an obligation, to ask difficult questions in the classroom without fear of being punished by a faculty member who may be embarrassed or angry because their views are different from the faculty member. That is a terrible idea, and the AAUP issued in the 1960s a joint statement with 5 national student organizations identifying precisely what student academic rights and freedoms are. ACTA supports that. Fifth, we believe that all faculty rights, academic freedom rights, have corresponding responsibilities and obligations. Academic freedom is not license, but instead represents responsibility to speak the truth of your discipline as you understand it in an honest way, and never, ever to self-censor. By doing so, for whatever reason, you deny the students the education that they deserve. ACTA, I believe, agrees with that, and that, I think, is accurately characterized in the 1940 Statement on Academic Freedom, which has now been supported, endorsed by over 200 learned societies. 30 new learned societies, old learned societies actually, have endorsed it in the last 2.5 years, I'm proud to say, including NCATE, Council of Independent Colleges, and virtually every disciplinary association in America endorses our statement on academic freedom. It is the definitive statement and was used by UNESCO in 1997 to write an international definition of academic freedom. If you will, it's the currency of America, the American Academy. 6, ACTA and AAUP agree that a heckler's veto should never be permitted or tolerated. That all people, whatever their ideology or political identity, should be encouraged to speak on campuses. That extending an invitation to a controversial speaker to give a lecture and then changing your mind because you worry about controversy is wrong. And ACTA supports us in that regard. And our recent statement on that issue was quickly endorsed by ACTA, I'm happy to say. And finally, 7th item, AAUP and ACTA share a belief in the importance of accountability. Indeed, that's part of their mission. It's been part of our mission since 1915. But here I think, and this is important to mention, our sense of what accountability means in the academy I think is different. And I think it's different for this reason. We are academicians. ACTA is not. We've been at this for almost 100 years, representing the profession. ACTA, mainly since 9/11, has been denouncing the profession. Big differences. And here's where we disagree, 4 areas, and I'd like to elaborate on those especially. ACTA and AAUP do not share same understanding about the meaning of shared governance in the academy. What's the difference? We believe that if faculty are not involved in sharing governance with administration and governing boards, then academic freedom is going to be in jeopardy. ACTA, on the other hand, believes that faculty should be seen and not heard, or if heard, only on certain occasions and only in terms of what the trustees permit. Best evidence of that is the creation of an Institute for Effective Governance. Anyone heard of IEG? No one. Ask any faculty member in Colorado, they'll tell you they've heard about it, because the ACTA method has taken over the selection of presidents in Colorado. And you see more and more presidents of public institutions in Colorado because Governor Bill Owens, former Governor Bill Owens, has endorsed ACTA's IEG, coming not from the academy, but instead being chosen by trustees, generally politicians or friends of the governors. That, I'm afraid, is a trend that is frightening, has happened in Florida, New York, certainly Colorado. Our notion of shared governance is that faculty have the primary responsibility for setting the curriculum and for making decisions about, through peer review, who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, and the like. I'm not sure that ACTA shares that view. Second, we disagree on who exactly has the authority to set academic standards, including determining the curriculum and the hiring of faculty. Ann Neal testified to Congress, and this is a public document, that trustees should require faculty, and I'm quoting now, to present points of view other than their own in a balanced way. She called for Congress, and I'm quoting, to hold periodic hearings to raise awareness of this problem. In our judgment, that is an invitation to disaster, not altogether different from David Horowitz calling for legislation, but asking Congress to monitor what is taught and how it is taught in America's academy. It seems to me is inviting outside intrusion where it should not happen. Third area where we disagree. ACTA advocates limits to academic freedom. What are those limits precisely? The faculty, and I'm quoting Ann Neal, the faculty's academic freedom should end at the point where professors abuse special trust they are given to respect students' academic freedom to learn. Now, first obvious question, what is ACTA and who is ACTA to suggest this? Secondly, who decides the point at which abuse has taken place? What criteria are used? ACTA's or impartial, neutral criteria such as the AAUP and what the American Academy has been using for 100 years? Seems to me that the suggestion of limits based on their perception that student rights are somehow being abused without any regard for whether that's true or not is a danger to the academy. And the fourth area where we disagree, and this is the subject of tonight's discussion, is a very, very different sense about the autonomy of the academy. Ann says, and rather eloquently in my judgment, well, wait a minute. Autonomy is something the academy is hiding behind in order to avoid accountability. If you read her article in the Montana Professor, she believes that the public has a responsibility, and they represent the public somehow. I don't know how. I don't know who elected them to represent the public, but she believes that ACTA has a right, indeed an obligation, to identify those faculty who are abusing the professorial responsibility that the AAUP has identified, and then has the temerity, in my judgment, to refer to the 1915 statement, saying the 1940 statement is somehow a perversion of all genuine academic freedom values. Well, I will tell you, and I hope we have the opportunity in our exchange, that she has not read the 1915 statement, or if she has, the lessons have not been learned. The 1940 statement is a repeat, a terse account of the 1915 statement. In both cases, the AAUP says clearly that with academic rights come academic responsibilities. One crucial one, which we say very clearly, the faculty has a responsibility not to introduce controversial subject matter that has no relationship to the course or the topic you're teaching. So if you're a chemistry professor and you spend an hour ranting and raving about the George Bush's violation of international rights because of Iraq, that's inappropriate. Students are there to learn chemistry, not about the faculty member's opinion about George Bush and the Iraq War. That's wrong. We agree on that. But in an election year, the beginning of a class, and a faculty member says, hey, I read in the paper today, the average icebreaker. We in the academy, we faculty, understand that faculty do that all the time. Those outside the academy who have never taught a college class don't understand that. They think that somehow we should be policing ourselves in a more militant way. Well, ladies and gentlemen, AAUP has been policing the academy and censoring wayward institutions for the last 90 years. But we've been doing it when administrations violate the academic freedom of faculty, which faculty alone, not administrators, not trustees, and certainly not ACTA. Faculty alone decide when academic freedom has been abridged or violated or misused or abused. That's our position. Very, very different, in my judgment, from what ACTA sees. Merits, I think, because Anne will say otherwise, because she has, on one occasion, let me quote it, most recent report, how many were Churchills? Their words, not mine, and I'm quoting, I think the report's up here, you're welcome to take it. I did not bring it, Anne did. That the report, how many were Churchills, is designed, and I'm quoting, to induce the public to demand better information and more accountability from the colleges and universities they support. Wait a minute. 1915 statement says it quite clearly. There's something called the tyranny of public opinion. And that tyranny of public opinion is usually based on incomplete information and oftentimes voiced by those who have never been to college. In our judgment, AAUP's judgment, ACTA is reaching out and trying to shape public opinion in a way that will allow them to introduce their extremist agenda into the academy to the detriment of academic freedom. Professors alone have the right to determine what shall be taught, how it shall be taught, to whom it shall be taught. And the 1940 statement, and I will quote it here, refers to both the freedoms and the responsibilities, and then I'll stop. Teachers are entitled to full freedom in research and in publication of the results, subject to the adequate performance of their other academic duties. But research for pecuniary return should be based upon an understanding with the authorities of the institution. In other words, we don't go into this for the money, and if you're doing some side business, you better make sure it's ethical. So with that right comes a responsibility. Second, teachers are entitled freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matter which has no relation to their subject. Anne says this happens all the time, that Ward Churchill is not unusual, he is common. And that statement was sent not to AAUP, that's a polite reminder, but instead to as many people as they could reach. And third, college and university teachers are citizens, members of a learned profession, and officers of an educational institution. When they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline. But, and here's the obligation, the responsibility, their special position in the community imposes special obligations. As scholars and educational officers, they should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. So yes, the 1940 statement is not a backward step for the 1915. It is a summary of the essence of the 1915 statement. Academic freedom and the meaning of it has not changed, and whatever ACTA says to the contrary is simply false. ACTA points to one aspect of the 1915 statement which is quoted in virtually all of their publications. In 1915, it was not uncommon for faculty to regard students as immature and warn faculty not to take advantage of their immaturity by brainwashing or indoctrinating them. Guess what? AAUP in the 1940 statement and now in 2007 still believes that is true. Not that students are so immature, but that faculty have an obligation not to preach, but instead to teach, and always teach from the truths of their discipline and avoid, whenever possible, extraneous opinion that has nothing to do with the subject matter. That has not changed for almost 100 years. But you'll hear Ms. Neal and ACTA say AAUP has retreated from that, and it makes no difference to us any longer that the 1940 statement and academic freedom as it's defined is something we hide behind to allow us the license to opine on a regular basis in the classroom. Categorically untrue, and their saying otherwise does not make it so. Finally, if I may, my time all right?
You're about up.
Our Red Book, which is the compendium of all policy statements, significant policy statements we have written for the last 100 years, probably sits on President Dennison's desk, certainly his provost's desk, if she were here. You're the acting provost, I understand. But certainly in the dean's desk. And you will see in there not simply the 1940 statement, not simply the 1915 statement, which is also there, though Anna is upset it's not on our website, but you'll also see statements against speech codes. You'll see statements, policy statements on professional ethics, statements on student rights and freedoms, statements on discrimination, statements on distance learning, statements on research and how to evaluate research, statements, policy statements on post-tenure review, and virtually every aspect that the professoriate faces in higher education is in the Red Book. ACTA, to my knowledge, has never cited any statement other than a few paragraphs in the 1915 and a few paragraphs in the 1940 statement. In my judgment, and the judgment of my colleagues in AAUP, there are gaps in ACTA's education. They need to read the Red Book. They need to familiarize themselves with the professoriate before they launch into these tirades, these excessive criticisms of a faculty of which they are not a part, have never been a part, and will never be a part. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's a clear indication that you didn't have a good Valentine's Day date. And I want to thank President Dennison and Linda and Dick Walton for really helping on the Montana Professor and for making this evening possible. It is indeed a pleasure to be part of this vital discussion on academic freedom, and you're to be commended for realizing that there are generally at least two sides to any issue. In fact, you're putting into practice tonight what my organization recommends be done as a matter of course. In the interest of full disclosure, I think it's worth sharing how this debate got named. Both interlocutors were asked to suggest a title. I proposed Academic Freedom, Academic Responsibility. A perfectly reasonable title, I hope you will agree. Not so Dr. Bowen. My debate partner wanted instead a title that is frankly more debatable in every sense of the word. He insisted on institutional autonomy and academic freedom. Should colleges and universities be left alone by non-academics? One of the fine professionals with whom I've been working described the title in an email to me as polemical. I would agree. And perhaps that's why the title advertised drops off the second part of Dr. Bowen's equation. But then again, why should we expect anything different? Dr. Bowen has made it clear that he thinks non-academics, such as my organization, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, a group of thousands of engaged trustees, alumni, and yes, even academics around the country. We non-academics should just darn well leave him and his fellow doctorates in the ivory tower alone. Non-academics includes me, a player on the field of higher education for some decades, and non-academics also includes a far larger group, many of whom I hope are in the audience, namely parents, taxpayers, students, and of course, probably not here tonight, but nevertheless included legislators. Now I should make it very clear. We at ACTA agree that the responsibility for ensuring academic freedom and excellence should fall first and foremost to colleges and universities themselves. We agree that the law is a blunt instrument. We agree that state legislatures and the federal Congress are not well positioned to prescribe specific remedies. We have said so many times and have elaborated on this point at length in our report, Intellectual Diversity, Time for Action, which you will find here in the room on the table. But a problem arises when colleges and universities fail to ensure academic freedom and academic excellence, even after numerous cases, lawsuits, and studies show that there is a systemic, ongoing problem. When reasonable calls for action are ignored, when public outcry is dismissed, and when the academic establishment denies that anything is wrong, we non-academics who care deeply about higher education simply cannot bury our heads in the sand. We must not shrink from taking this task on. Most importantly, we should make it crystal clear that universities must be accountable if they wish non-academics to stay out of their business. In the old days, Dr. Bowen's organization, the American Association of University Professors, agreed. But today, the AAUP is seriously confused about what academic freedom means and what academic responsibility entails. Tonight's topic is evidence A of that. Let me explain. The enormous autonomy that faculties are granted in the name of academic freedom is premised on the assumption that faculty perform according to professional scholarly standards. That autonomy represents a compact, if you will, a trust, given on the condition that universities make academic decisions on academic grounds, not on partisan or other prejudicial grounds. It is a trust conveyed with the understanding that academic freedom entails both a right and a responsibility, or to use the AAUP's terms, corresponding duties and correlative obligations. This is evident in the AAUP's 1915 Declaration of Principles, which says, and I quote, "The university teacher, in giving instruction upon controversial matters, while he is under no obligation to hide his own opinion, should, if he is fit for his position, in dealing with such subjects, set forth justly the divergent opinions of other investigators. He should cause his students to become familiar with the best published expressions of the great historic types of doctrine upon the questions at issue. And he should, above all, remember that his business is not to provide his students with ready-made conclusions, but to train them to think for themselves and to provide them access to those materials which they need if they are to think intelligently." Originally then, the AAUP concerned itself not only with professors' academic freedom to teach, research, and speak, but also with students' academic freedom to learn about all sides of controversial issues. This right was articulated again in the 1940 Academic Freedom Statement, as well as in other AAUP comments pertaining to faculty professional responsibilities and professional ethics. But tellingly, the 1915 statement no longer appears on the AAUP website, and while the other references to academic freedom can be found on the site, successive generations of AAUP statements and interpretations have increasingly centered less on professors' obligations to ensure students' free inquiry and more on professors' rights when making public statements. Over time, the principle of the disinterested search for the truth has been supplanted by a conception of academic freedom that views professors more as individual political actors than teachers. This perspective was vividly on display last fall when various college faculties, as well as the AAUP, submitted briefs opposing the Solomon Amendment, which you will recall denies federal funding to colleges and universities that fail to give equal access to military recruiters. These briefs consistently and reflexively invoked academic freedom and faculty autonomy, not as a foundation of the objective search for the truth, but as a prerequisite for espousing a particular political viewpoint. According to the AAUP, the Solomon Amendment interferes with faculty academic freedom and with collective academic governance. By requiring equal rather than adequate access for military recruitment, the AAUP argues, the Solomon Amendment improperly discriminates against the viewpoints of faculty who oppose don't ask, don't tell. By this logic, faculty academic freedom includes the right to deny students equal access to military recruiters until, and here I quote from Dr. Bowen, such time as the U.S. military changes its anti-discrimination policies to accord with the more enlightened of the academy. A unanimous Supreme Court found that faculty arguments were arrogant and fanciful. Justices from left, right, and center concurred that the case against the Solomon Amendment was grounded more in ideological commitments than in constitutional law. The court unequivocally found that requiring colleges and universities receiving federal funds to allow military recruiters on campus had nothing to do with academic freedom, freedom of association, or faculty governance. A military recruiter's mere presence on campus does not violate a law school's right to associate, said the court, regardless of how repugnant the law school considers the recruiter's message. And yet, even after a unanimous Supreme Court made it perfectly clear that academic freedom is not involved, Dr. Bowen has kept up the claim. On numerous occasions since the decision was reached, Dr. Bowen has let it be known that the professoriate knows better than the U.S. Congress and U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes, that's true.
As he wrote in the Montana Professor, the threat of the Supreme Court's ruling is real, punitive, and undemocratic. It says endorse the values of the conservative majority in Congress or operate your universities without benefit of the people's money. Now, if Dr. Bowen thinks that's what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was thinking when she voted to uphold the amendment, perhaps he should leave the court watching to lawyers. Academic freedom here is simply being used as a club, beating off those who disagree with the wielder's view. So much for its original purpose of protecting the existence of multiple perspectives, so much for upholding the Academy's obligation to enable students to decide for themselves what they think, what they believe, and for whom they wish to work. Rather than preventing viewpoint discrimination, banning military recruiters is viewpoint discrimination, and the AAUP's endorsement of such viewpoint discrimination undermines the integrity of the university. My, how things have changed since 1915. Unfortunately, if we are to have a meaningful dialogue about academic freedom today, and if we are to protect academic freedom for the future, we must recognize that the AAUP should be regarded neither as the main arbiter of academic freedom nor as its most trustworthy protector. We must recognize that following the AAUP's lead, numerous academics are abusing the concept of academic freedom. We must recognize that the debate surrounding academic freedom is riddled with confusion on the part of academics and non-academics alike. Let me give you some recent examples. At the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, faculty invoked academic freedom as a reason to avoid assigning graded work prior to the midpoint of the semester. The University of California cut from its academic freedom statement a prohibition against using the classroom as a platform for propaganda. Its reason? UC believes there's no longer a difference between the interested and disinterested search for truth. Dr. Bowen and Carrie Nelson, the president of the AAUP, have said that the 1915 Declaration of Principles, and you heard this earlier, is outdated. According to the two of them, students are no longer immature and vulnerable, words I might say that are used in the AAUP statement. They have opinions on just about everything from the get-go. Of course, that's not the point. The point is that professors have an obligation to teach according to scholarly standards precisely because students do not know the subject and cannot be expected to challenge, engage, or outthink the professor in a meaningful way. Dr. Bowen has also written in the Montana Professor, and you heard this again this evening, that academic freedom and institutional autonomy mean boards should not appoint non-academics to presidencies and chancellorships. As these examples indicate, the AAUP has drifted rather far from its founding ideals, and even AAUP members are saying so. Robert Post, former general counsel of the AAUP, recently warned that it was time to return to first principles. The function of academic freedom is not to liberate individual professors from all forms of institutional regulation, he wrote, but to ensure that faculty within the university are free to engage in the professionally competent forms of inquiry and teaching that are necessary for the realization of the social purposes of the university. As Post sees it, the professoriate has come all too easily to assume academic freedom as our God-given right, and has become oblivious to its distinct justifications and limitations. Far from releasing faculty from restraints within or without the university, Post argues, and I quote, "The traditional ideal of freedom of research can be sustained only if existing institutions of peer review interpret these professional norms in a manner that maintains their internal legitimacy. Academic freedom does not now, nor has it ever, protected the autonomy of professors to pursue their own individual work free from university restraints." Likewise, William Van Alsten, former general counsel and president of the AAUP, recently wrote to me to express his sense that ACTA is providing a necessary corrective. Quote, "As a former national president of AAUP, as well as its former general counsel and chair of Committee A, while not uniformly in agreement with all of the particular positions you and your organization have taken, I find a very great deal in your own presentations and your work to admire," he wrote. "Far from being an undue threat to academic freedom, I have found a substantial part of your criticisms to be well taken. Much of it is in fact closer to the views well reflected in the original 1915 AAUP Statement of Principles, and indeed quite well grounded also in the widely endorsed 1940 Joint Statement that has been fairly credited to you." You and I just heard Dr. Bowen. He said that ACTA is just a group of know-nothings who believe the professoriate is too liberal. He said that cases of preaching in the classroom are merely isolated incidents and that conservative students complain because they don't want to have their beliefs challenged. In non-academic lingo, this is what he is saying. Legislators, taxpayers, parents, and students, give us your money, give us tenure, give us tax breaks, and then leave us alone. We alone can understand and enforce our professional norms. Trust us to do the right thing and butt out. But what he is prescribing is not just institutional autonomy, it is freedom from accountability. By contrast, ACTA insists on that accountability. We believe in academic freedom and academic excellence. We believe in liberal education and the transformative power of ideas. We believe that higher education exists not for its own edification, but to serve the greater public good, to promote knowledge, to prepare informed citizens, effective workers, and lifelong learners. And we believe for all these reasons that higher education must be accountable to that same public. You might say our mantra is trust but verify. Our goal is not to take issue with certain fields of study, as Dr. Bowen has suggested, but rather to discern whether we and the non-academic public we represent should believe that higher ed is doing what it claims to be doing. In our report, How Many Ward Churchills, for example, we didn't go into the classroom, we didn't tape professors' classes, and we conceded in the report that we could not comment on what happens in the classroom. In other words, we did not intrude. But we did look at the publicly available course descriptions on which students base their decisions about what courses to take. And what we found was case after case, example after example, at school after school, of professors openly pushing a political agenda in the name of critical thinking. In 2004, after hearing from Dr. Bowen and others that there was no intellectual diversity problem in higher ed, that professors left their politics at the classroom door, ACTA commissioned the Center for Survey Research and Analysis at the University of Connecticut to study students' perceptions of their academic experience and to find out what they had to say. Here is what we learned. A shocking 49% said that their professors frequently injected political comments into their courses, even if they had nothing to do with the subject. 29% felt that they had to agree with their professors' political views to get a good grade. 48% reported campus panels and lecture series on political issues that seemed totally one-sided. 46% said professors used the classroom to present their personal political views. 42% faulted reading assignments for presenting only one side of a controversial issue, and 83% said student evaluation forms did not give them an opportunity to comment about a professor's social, political, or religious bias. We confronted the Academy with this evidence, and we were dismissed out of hand. Nearly 2 years ago, Roger and I debated in Washington, and I asked him then, can the Academy offer any proof that the students are wrong? Has it conducted its own surveys to test the claim that campuses are becoming biased? Has it tried to determine whether students' educations are being impaired by the classroom climate? Has it taken concrete steps to ensure that academic freedom is understood, promoted, and encouraged? Has the AAUP ever placed sanctions on a university where these kinds of violations occur? I regret to say, both now and then, the answer was no. Rather than addressing this critical issue, the AAUP did the usual. It dodged the question and attacked the messenger. It even contended in its magazine that ideological imbalance doesn't matter since students aren't really influenced by their professors. But if that were true, there would be no reason for us to be here tonight. A little over a year ago, ACTA published a booklet entitled Intellectual Diversity, Time for Action. In it, we called upon the Academy to take internal steps to warrant public confidence. Our message was clear. The Academy cannot expect to retain institutional autonomy and the public support necessary to sustain it unless it reassures the public that it is abiding by professional standards. This is much the same message sent by the late Kermit Hall, to whom the current issue of the Montana Professor is dedicated. Shortly before his death, he wrote that, quote, only when higher education is willing to address squarely the question of political imbalance in faculties or the existence of an oppressive campus orthodoxy will we command full legitimacy. Since 1995, when ACTA was founded, there's been a growing consensus that attention is needed from inside and outside if American higher ed is to remain the finest in the world. And this is the point with which I will conclude. Don't let Dr. Bowen fool you. The answer to the question he himself posed, should colleges and universities be left alone by non-academics, is a resounding no. And don't just take it from me. Take it from some academics. Excellence Without a Soul by former Harvard Dean Harry Lewis and Our Underachieving Colleges by current Harvard President Derek Bach depict shocking cases of preaching in the classroom, colleges and universities that lack a cohesive curriculum, students who cannot write and have little understanding of what it means to be an American, trustees asleep at the switch. And they are written not for an academic audience, but for the public at large. My message is simple. Non-academics, alumni, trustees, parents, students, the public can and must help address these problems in appropriate ways. If I may quote Professor Lewis, the stakeholders can force change. Universities were never truly ivory towers. They are privileged with independence and public support because they serve society. Thus, public scrutiny is appropriate and important. Unfortunately, Dr. Bowen does not understand that, but Dean Lewis does, and so do the thousands of alumni and trustees in ACTA's national network. They know that if our institutions of higher learning are to remain competitive, they must remain focused on academic standards, academic excellence, and accountability. They are seeking appropriate oversight of an educational system that relies on their support. They are rightly asserting concern about the academic and financial well-being of institutions of higher learning. And as awareness increases, we are beginning to see some positive changes. Strong public pressure led Columbia University President Lee Bollinger to issue new grievance guidelines in response to students' complaints about intimidation in the classroom. The University of Colorado is tightening up its hiring and promotion procedures in response to the public outcry over Ward Churchill. Colorado has also announced plans to address grade inflation. In recent years, the board of the State University of New York system has overseen general education curricular reform and launched an initiative on teacher quality. American University, in the face of unchecked presidential expenditures, revamped its governance procedures to ensure greater board oversight and transparency. Professors at South Dakota's public universities now include an academic freedom statement on their course syllabi, reminding students that their academic performance may be evaluated solely on an academic basis, not on opinions or conduct in matters unrelated to academic standards. And the list goes on. Not only that, but as I have shown, distinguished figures within the academy now acknowledge that higher education is failing to live up to its essential responsibilities. They are also recognizing that outside input of the sort promoted by ACTA is a crucial corrective to the academy's internal failures. If higher education is to recommit to its public purpose, if it is to return to its primary responsibilities of teaching and scholarship, academic leaders must relinquish the assumption that outside input is bad input. Happily, recent events suggest that this essential shift in outlook is already happening. What remains is for the AAUP to get soundly behind academic responsibility. I look forward to the day when that happens. Thanks.
I find it odd that two organizations, so both at least claiming to be so dedicated to academic freedom, have such contrary visions, and use the expression God-given right, as if faculty believe they have a God-given right to tenure.
That was Robert Post.
Robert Post.
That's your colleague.
I know Robert quite well. It's not a God-given right, and I'm sorry, sometimes when people read speeches, I miss a few words here and there. It's not a God-given right, it's a right that's earned. And this has to do, and this is part of ACTA's, or at least my attempt to educate ACTA, what they need to learn. We have accountability measures within the academy and within the professoriate that have worked fairly well. I won't say, nor will I ever say, that they're flawless. And both the 1915 statement and the 1940 statement says that the faculty have an obligation to weed out faculty who are incompetent. And the AAUP identifies incompetence or gross wrongs committed by faculty that allow tenure to be revoked. That's accountability. But when we hire a faculty person, whether it's the University of Montana, or Colby College, where I was for many years, faculty, not trustees, administration gets final say, speaking on behalf of the trustees, but faculty vet the credentials. Faculty interview the candidates. Faculty decide whether this person is competent. Never do we ask, what is your religious affiliation? What political party do you vote for? Do you believe that George Bush's war in Iraq is a good idea? But we do not do that. Not only is it against the law, but we think it's unprofessional. We are accountable to our profession and to our discipline, and we take the hiring and firing and promotion of faculty seriously. That's one area of accountability. Anytime a faculty member produces an article for publication, it goes through peer review. That's yet another way of accountability to make sure that the faculty member knows what he or she are saying within their field of expertise. We know the tyranny of student evaluations, and they can be tyrannical at times, but all faculty encourage students to honestly assess their teaching. Now, most institutions, and I know those instruments vary from institution to institution, I don't know what it's like here, But in my school, we always had room for narrative comments, and the student could blast away. Bowen went on and on today about Reagan's illegal war in Central America. I got that, absolutely. I heard that several times. But then they also judged the professor in terms of the quality of the material they presented, the way they presented it, and what the student learned, even if the student disagrees with what the faculty member is saying or ideologically opposes that message. It prompts students to think. We're accountable to students. We're accountable to administrators. We're accountable to one another within our disciplines. These are accountability measurements. And finally, at a Research One institution, we are accountable for the amount of research dollars we bring in. I mean, that determines our future. It determines our status. So the kind of external grants that we are able to bring in not only bring prestige to the institution, but it is yet another accountability measure. I will add, more and more, particularly since Carnegie got involved, we're more accountable to civic engagement issues. Faculty are unselfish often with their time and getting involved in community activities. Faculty are members of a community. Some faculty even run for office. I mean, even elected to office in some places. It works. So my point generally is that professionals reviewing other professionals is, yes, within the academy, but they are accountability standards that have been developed over time that usually, not always, but usually weed out the strong from the weak, the competent from the incompetent. And so in that way, we guard our discipline and we guard our profession. And goes on and on. AAUP should do this. AAUP should do that. Let's look at what AAUP is. It is a professional association that identifies best standards. And with regard to academic freedom and shared governance, when administrations violate those best practices and high standards, we investigate and occasionally use censure. That's what we do. We do not go to campus to campus and identify the war Churchills to the, whatever the allegations are, and say, you ought to be fired. We don't do that. ACTA, on the other hand, right after 9/11, there were a number of faculty around the country uttered unpatriotic statements, and their names made it into an ACTA publication where they were denounced for being unpatriotic. Now, if that support for academic freedom or extramural utterances, which ACTA claims to support, I don't get it. That, to me, is political maneuvering. They're not neutral. I mean, they are biased, and they're biased in a particular way. Yeah, AAUP, as Ann's survey has shown, and others, probably, in social sciences and humanities, consist of more Democrats and liberals than Republicans or conservatives. Such is the nature of the professorate. But guess what? That's not bad. That in itself is no reason to indict, and that is no reason for the conservatives, Ann's group, to muster their forces and say, as they did up until this last election, we got the White House, we got Congress, we got the Supreme Court, and now we're going to get the Academy. I mean, this was a battle plan, and I don't use that word without reason. Roger Kimball wrote the article. Roger Kimball is a supporter of ACTA. A battle plan on how to retake the university was Roger Kimball's article. It's in public domain. Read it. Said, we love Ward Churchill. That's the scab that we can tear off and expose these people for being so liberal. Well, come on. And I start reading language like that from ACTA publications. I said, Jesus, this is awful. 1915 statement, which Ann loves, said that social problems was the term used to refer to the social sciences back then. Scholars who address them, I'm quoting now, should not be in a position of dependence upon the favor of any social class or group. that the disinterestedness and impartiality of their inquiries and their conclusions shall be, so far as humanly possible, beyond the reach of suspicion. Guess what? The 1915 statement said, if you teach in the social sciences, and today and more, arts and humanities, you're a target. Everybody's going to comment on whether you're biased or not. And that's sort of the area in which ACT is going. I'm quoting 1915 now. In the political, social, and economic fields, almost every question is more or less affected by private or class interest. That's the 1915 statement that Anne reveres so much. It pointed out in the 1915 statement, read it, that trustees, rich trustees that Anne represents, tend to be conservative. And I'm quoting now, their vested interest may conflict with academic authority. Well, 1915 statement warned us, and it's right. Trustees' interest and faculty interest are not always the same, nor should they be. What gets scary is when Anne goes to Congress and says, here it is, testimony of Anne Neal, I'm sorry, this is before October 29, 2003. Here are the things that universities should be doing. And I'm quoting now. Trustees should make clear that they will not tolerate ideological or political discrimination in the hiring, firing, or promoting of faculty. Trustees should monitor tenure decisions, both granting and denying, on a regular basis. Trustees are volunteer positions, even if they're so-called activist trustees. Who has the time to get involved in doing the faculty members' work? Amazes me. Second, trustees should direct administrators and faculty to engage, this is, I love one, in an intellectual, you use the quotation marks, not me, in an intellectual diversity inventory to see whether students are exposed to diverse points of view in classroom readings, speaker series, etc., and whether partisan or ideological bias is influencing hiring and retention. Is that a job that any trustee or governing board anywhere in the country could take on, has the competence to take on, and if they did take it on, would understand what they're doing? An intellectual diversity inventory. How do we do that now? I want all faculty, this is the inventory, who voted Democrat last time to mark D. All those who voted Republican mark R. Send me your results, and that'll be the first step in the intellectual diversity inventory. David Horowitz did it. He was laughed out of California, and ACT is going in that direction. Why? I mean, last I heard, this was a two-party system, and there's nothing wrong with being a Democrat, even when the Republicans control the House, the Supreme Court, and the White House. You know, Congress, Anne's words again, I'm quoting, should hold periodic hearings to raise public awareness of this problem, the problem being lack of intellectual diversity, and should encourage faculty, administrators, and boards of trustees voluntarily to conduct intellectual diversity reviews. Whoa! Have you had an intellectual diversity review at the University of Montana? And if you haven't, would you know how to do it? And if you knew how to do it, who would do it? And if somebody did agree to do it, who would make judgments about the results? And would the governing board then say, based on these results of this intellectual diversity review, the following policy should be enacted? Whoa, I would not want to be President Dennison on this campus at that time. Finally, she adds, Congress should target federal grants to promote the study and teaching of American history, politics, and the law. ACTA commends Senator Gregg for sponsoring SR 1515, the Higher Education for Freedom Act, which focuses on this need. Now, I've not read that act, and I leave it to Anne to comment on what it exactly says, but I do know that throughout this country and state after state there has been a political movement to influence the curriculum, which by AAUP standards only faculty can set, and to make that curriculum more patriotic, more American, less global, less diverse, less concerned with diversity, and certainly not concerned with issues of social justice, environmental justice, and the like. That, though they will not admit it publicly, is ACTA's agenda. Has AAUP been flawless in its defense of academic freedom? No. We've made mistakes. No doubt about it. But I think we've done more good than bad. And though, yes, we may have some who say 1915 is better than 1940, this is an intramural debate, and I can watch your eyes glaze over as Ann and I even mention it. Who cares? You never read the documents. And even if you did, would it make sense? In the comments. I probably went over my 10 minutes. Oh, one last. This is for the record, because I think there's a misunderstanding.
All for the record, Roger.
I was simply asked, what topic do you want to debate? I was never told, and Linda will say this, that you would suggest a topic. I didn't know, and I didn't care. So.
Are you finished? Well, I just don't know where to start. Roger said that we're not neutral. Well, if by that he means that we are biased in favor of academic freedom and academic excellence, he is right, because we are biased that way. ACTA has often talked about preaching, not teaching in the classroom. And sometimes when I'm with Roger, I sort of think, preaching, not teaching. Preaching, not teaching. He's, as you may perhaps have noticed, he likes to go talk about personalities. He likes to wildly talk about rich trustees and conservatives here and conservatives there. Never once in my discussion did I talk about politics. Only Roger talks about politics, and I think that's part of the problem. We shouldn't be talking about politics. We should be talking about scholarly standards and adhering to them, and that is what ACTA's message is. Now, Roger said that the AAUP helps all faculty, that it transcends ideological differences, and I hope that's so, but I wonder. K.C. Johnson, who is a professor at Brooklyn College, was nearly denied tenure because of his lack of collegiality. The Board of Trustees got involved, and he ultimately received tenure. He is a highly regarded Harvard-trained historian who has had numerous books published. And he was suffering because he dared to suggest that a panel had not been balanced at Brooklyn. He dared to suggest that a selection committee had been not working on basis of merit but on other criteria. And these things came back to bite him, and all of a sudden he found, after an exemplary record, that he was being denied tenure. Where was the AAUP? Now, I did check with KC just to make certain that it wasn't there, and he did say he had 2 friendly emails and that he asked them to send a statement, but they were not publicly involved. Thomas Klochek at DePaul, where was the AAUP? Rob Nadelson, where was the AAUP? Where was the ACLU? Where was anybody when he raised concerns about political viewpoint discrimination? And I appreciate very much that the AAUP did in 2006 issue a statement discouraging universities from disinviting speakers. And they did this in the context of Michael Moore, who had been disinvited at George Mason. And I will agree that that was wrong. I think it was a mistake. Either they should have kept him and brought in someone else to provide an alternative perspective. But where was the AAUP when Jeane Kirkpatrick was disinvited? Where were they when Netanyahu was run off the stage at Berkeley? Where were they at UTexas when Kissinger couldn't come to speak because of students and other outrage? They only came to the table when Michael Moore was involved. Now, speech codes, again, Roger and I agree that speech codes are reprehensible. And they did, in fact, have a statement in 1991 about speech codes, but they were pretty late to the discussion. If you read a new book out by Don Downs, and I'm sorry I don't remember exactly the title, he talks about the imposition of the speech code at the University of Wisconsin, which he ultimately, along with some other faculty, helped to eliminate. The AAUP was nowhere to be found, and in fact, the faculty there had to rise up in their own independent group to fight for academic freedom and to fight against what he referred to as moral bullying and progressive censorship. The AAUP was nowhere to be seen. Now again, Shared governance. Obviously, shared governance, just like academic freedom, is an important, very essential aspect of the academic enterprise. And we believe, ACTA does in fact believe strongly in shared governance, and that the process is an inclusive one. But sometimes I think when Roger looks at shared governance, it is to suggest that trustees, particularly on academic matters, should remain quiet, and that they simply are to look on when it comes to academic issues. And ACTA has been outspoken in saying that as fiduciaries, trustees are responsible not only for the financial but also for the academic well-being of their institutions. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that trustees should be looking at syllabi or suggesting that some books are not on a list, or that they've got a friend who would be a really good teacher and that friend should come in? Of course not. But trustees, since they are fiduciaries for the institution, and since they are obligated by law to bring that big picture, do have an opportunity, and we believe an obligation, to examine what their institutions are requiring and to determine what it is they want their educated graduates to know. We believe that trustees are in a far better position to ask and answer that question than individual professors may be. Of course, a biology professor is a marvelous expert in biology. Does that biology professor have a better perspective on what the graduates of the institution should know when they get out so that they can be informed citizens? I would suggest no, not necessarily. And that's what we have strongly encouraged trustees to look at. And there have been some excellent examples, and I think all very positive and all for the benefit of students. We saw at George Mason University where they did a comprehensive curricular review initiated by the faculty, brought to the trustees. The trustees essentially liked all of the proposal but felt that Western civilization and American history should be part of a George Mason graduate's experience. Now, the faculty voted a vote of no confidence after the trustees said this. It got into the newspaper. The public said, hey, I think somebody who graduates from George Mason should know who George Mason is. This doesn't seem to be an unreasonable request on the part of the trustees. And so it was resolved, and the trustees quite properly said, all right, faculty, we've told you generally that we would like to see this in the curriculum. It's now up to you to decide how to do it. And I think, again, that's an excellent example. Similarly, we have asked trustees to look at general education. Now, I know this is a discussion that's ongoing here at the University of Montana. This is something that we've talked about in a number of books, and I brought both of them. We have one called The Hollow Core and another, Becoming an Educated Person. And again, this gets back to the public mission and public role of the university. We believe the general education curriculum is really where the rubber hits the road. This is where freshmen and sophomores can be provided exposure to general areas of knowledge that will help them to be informed citizens. And while most universities do say that they provide a coherent general education, in fact, if you look at the catalogs and if you analyze what is being offered, it's often hundreds and hundreds of courses which meet distribution requirements. So it is possible for a student today to go to college for 4 or more likely 6 years and never have an American history course, never have a Western civilization course, maybe not have a world history course, maybe not have a comparative religion course. There's really no structure. And we think that is a sorry state of affairs. And so we urge boards of trustees to examine what it is being offered as a general education curriculum and to decide. Perhaps they will decide, like Brown, that they don't want to have any requirements and that students should be told that. We have commended Brown because it is very clear. If you go to Brown, it's catch as catch can, you got to find it yourself. But we have raised questions about other institutions which in their catalog say, we will ensure that our students get an excellent exposure to broad areas of knowledge, and in fact, they don't. And so we think, again, that's a part of being honesty in advertising, and we think it's important for boards to be asking those questions and working with their faculty and their administrators to have an answer, or at least to examine it. whatever conclusion they reach, we think the important thing is that they at least take on the question and address it. Now, I also want to take on another issue that Roger talked about. He seems to believe that presidents and chancellors should never be non-academics. And I just want to look out into the universe to see what kind of examples we might find. Now, Hank Brown was the example you utilized, and I will tell you, he actually does not belong to the Institute for Effective Governance, Roger, so check your facts next time. But
I didn't say Hank Brown did.
But Hank Brown
Governor
is
Owen.
obviously a former senator. He is a businessman, someone well versed in the situation in Colorado, a graduate of CU himself, and at a time of great challenges at CU, after Ward Churchill, after drinking problems, after an athletics scandal, he was brought in, and I think he's been doing a marvelous job. Now, maybe Roger and I don't agree, but it seems to me he was a perfect selection for the time, and I believe the faculty said so. We can take a look at Colorado College, Dick Celeste, former Democratic governor of Ohio. He's president of that college, and from the last thing I heard, the college is still surviving, doing quite well. We can look at David Borum, the University of Oklahoma. And I sat at dinner tonight with someone whose son is there. Again, despite the fact it is a politician, seems to be doing okay. So, or we can, let me just look at one more. We can look at the new school, Bob Kerrey, former senator from Nebraska. Certainly not a conservative from Roger's point of view. I think he's doing an excellent job. And I think it's very interesting. He was quite outspoken recently. Students at New School decided that they would invite Ward Churchill. And they said they were delighted to be bringing this wonderful man in who had an exemplary record of academic achievements. Now, what Bob Kerrey said was, and we thought it was excellent, and we praised him. He said, I think those kids are crazy. I don't think Ward Churchill has much to offer, but I will certainly support their decision to invite him. And when I try to invite others who have different perspectives, I hope the students will be as receptive to my decisions as I am to theirs. And I think if you'll recall, he had Senator McCain come and visit, and he was given a very hard time. So I will disagree with you, Roger. I think that academics and non-academics alike can be excellent presidents, and that we should certainly not suggest that hiring people outside the classroom wall somehow violates academic freedom. You also talked about the tyranny of public opinion. I wanted also to raise one other issue in terms of intellectual diversity and the problem that we're talking about. I think it's not an easy issue. It's a very nuanced issue. It's an issue that's hard to debate because it is a nuanced issue with many appropriate interests involved. It isn't frequently so simple or so obvious as teachers blasting students or running them out of the room. I mean, I don't know that it's that easy, but I do think there is a real issue of unspoken assumptions, an entrenched consensus that affects hiring and promotion and publishing and graduate student attrition, retention, course offerings, course content. There's just, shall we say, that oppressive orthodoxy that Kermit Hall was talking about. I think that's the issue here. And I think if faculty members talk to one another, if students talk to one another, that many, if not all, will say, well, yes, now that I think about it, affirmative action, you know, we just don't really talk about that in the class. I do think that there are so many topics that are off limit that we almost are not cognizant of it anymore. And I think a perfect example was Nadine Strassen, who was head of the ACLU. And she was teaching in the law school, and she was teaching about affirmative action. She could not get anyone in the class to take an anti-affirmative action position. So she took it herself. And more power to her. I'm so glad she did, because again, this way the students were being exposed to a variety of perspectives on an important issue. But I think that underscores for me what I think is a prevalent problem, and one that we should be worried about, and the reason that ACTA is asking that the Academy examine itself. And I want to make certain it's very, very clear. Our prescriptions are Academy, do it yourself. Academy, that means preferably the faculty on their own, faculty working with presidents, trustees working with faculty and administrators, examining your own processes to reassure the public that things are being conducted according to scholarly standards. We don't believe that this should be done by outsiders, but we do believe that simply saying it's not a problem, calling people conservatives, telling them they don't know anything, is not the answer. That the answer should be some sort of proactive effort and willingness to engage the issue. And Roger and I talk quite a bit, and I guess my frustration frequently is I don't ever think we really engage the issue. It's deny, what do you say? Deny, what do you say? Deny, and I think that's what I'm hoping, and I want to thank the University of Montana for having this, because I think we've got to get beyond denial, and we've got to get to that point that Kermit Hall said, that we really address this not only for the health of the students, but also for the reassurance of the public and the taxpayers who support public institutions.
Well, thank you both very much. And now it's time for all of you to get involved. And we do have 2 microphones, and I see Michelle has claimed the first one, so go, Michelle.
To which Lord any honor, to seigneur tout honneur. Thank you very much. It's a kind of rhetorical comment, or it's not really a question, a notation if you want. Since the beginning of university, as you know, there has been a battle between city government, bishop, the king, and the students, right? And it's where the regions were invented, by the way, as a form of control. And throughout history, you have this tug of war between the establishment, the system, doesn't matter what you call it, and a certain complex reality. Remember, in 1917, President Wilson censored American University for patriotic reasons, and on and on. Remember McCarthy period, etc. So it's ongoing, and this new form of control or attempt at censorship took a new life in the 60s or 70s, excuse me, with Hilton Kramer, the new criterion against postmodern criticism, etc. Bill Kristol, you know, and it has been revived in the 80s, 90s with the neocon and Danish D'Souza, etc., Horowitz. Now, what is interesting, this is a routine, if you want. What's interesting in this country is that this takes this antagonism, this battle, takes a very special form. And it seems that this form always used as a smoke screen, excuse me, academic freedom and responsibility. But this attack on university always believe that university are a hotbed of radicals, of liberals, of communists. By the way, I know 2 main radical according to what you would qualify, like Howard Zinn and Chomsky. But besides that, it's like a bit, you know, the motto of let's go to Iraq because they are weapons of mass destruction. We are still looking for them. Where are those radicals in academia? Please show them. I mean, you know, the last two polls by the Chronicle of Higher Education, which established the standard for liberal arts studies, languages, etc., found out that one in a few years ago and one last spring that from 49 to 55% of university professors are conservative, moderate in their way of teaching, in the selection of material, in their way of dressing, in their way of acting. And as for those who declare themselves liberals, it's very tame. So what's going on here? I don't think there's a danger of radicalization. The problem, and I think there's a naivete there on your behalf a little bit, Dr. Boyne, if you allow me to say that. This is a very conservative institution in the US. There's no danger. The danger is that it's the uniformity, the homogenization of the student body, of academia. So please help me. Where are those radicals? Where are the weapons of mass destruction?
Do either of you care to comment?
Just briefly, I think the question's a serious one. David Horowitz recently published that little tome, 101 Most Dangerous Radicals. I don't know if anyone read it or not, but we counted, and a third of them were AAUP luminaries, including people like Eric Foner at Columbia, who took this very seriously. Eric contacted me. He's on our National Advisory Board. And Eric said, you know, Roger, when people start naming faculty, as Horowitz has, as a dangerous radical, I mean, he won the National Book Award, but, you know, his point was, look, my father and my uncle were both blacklisted during the McCarthy period. They were thriving faculty until someone said that they were a communist, and they lost their jobs. He said, my upbringing is to fight McCarthyism. If you read Helen Schrecker's book, she's on our National Council of AAUP, she cataloged, better than any other historian, the number of faculty who lost their jobs. You go back to the origins of AAUP, the president of Columbia during the First World War said, anyone who does not sign a loyalty oath will not teach at this university. I mean, American history is indeed, as Anne pointed out, one of oppressive orthodoxy. But I'm afraid oftentimes it's not the orthodoxy of the left or the liberals. Classic liberals, tolerant and open and saying, come on, we can live together, we can work together, we can talk together. The orthodoxy, I think, that's sometimes most frightening, and the ones that we remember, is the orthodoxy from the state. It tends to be rather conservative. So the Horowitz book was taken seriously by a lot of our members, not because of the content, and we found all kinds of mistakes, but because naming names, as their statement did right after the 9/11, and where some faculty said, oh, let's hope for 1,000 Mogadishus. Remember that? Columbia faculty. My God. Another faculty member out at Stanford put out in his syllabus, Middle Eastern Studies. This is a radical class, and anybody who's pro-Israeli better not take this class. Geez, AAUP denounced that. We thought that was dreadful, as did the administration there. That's wrong. But in times of political crisis, people do stupid things on both the right and the left, and faculty and administrators, but we remember, and I think faculty especially is sensitive to losing that right to speak. So where are the radicals? I think oftentimes they're in the imagination of those who conjure them up as have somehow subverting American morality and all that's good about the academy. We don't find them out there. One last point that I have to mention, for factual accuracy. If K.C. Johnson gives me permission, not only did we help him, but you'll find a file, because I read the whole thing in the AAUP headquarters, it's that thick. If he gives me permission, we have a 50-year rule, I'll release it to Ann, I'll release it to anybody, with letter after letter thanking us for helping him. Yeah, he was a conservative, but our point was we'll help the conservative. If Mr. Klochek...
Democrat who supports Hillary Clinton. Now, maybe that's a conservative from your perspective.
Well, no, he was the one who was claiming he was victimized, but your question earlier was, where was AAUP? When
you were not public, I said that. You were not public. I said that.
And do you have a comment?
Yeah, I want to address this in terms of, I don't think the question is where are the dangerous radicals, where are the dangerous conservatives. I think it's a question, again, of academic responsibility and accountability. I think we've got to keep coming back to that rather than being diverted into these labels. There's no question that there's been study after study that shows an ideological imbalance in the faculty. I mean, we can look at the American College Teacher by the Higher Education Research Institute. There are any number of studies that suggest there is an ideological imbalance. we have said repeatedly that we don't think that matters unless it has an effect in the classroom. And that's why we undertook the survey asking students what their experience was. And they quite clearly responded, you bet it's having an effect in the classroom. And I should say that survey, a majority of the students self-identified as liberals or radicals. So these were not just conservatives having a hard time. These were liberals and radicals who said that they were finding politics in the classroom. The other thing that I think is important is, and this is something actually that Casey Johnson has done a fair amount of research into because he is a historian and he's very concerned about it. What is the effect in other ways? There is documented effect in limiting the disciplinary diversity that clearly has an impact on students' ability to learn. If Ohio State, University of Michigan have over the years been places where you could find a strong core of military historians. They're not there anymore. They're not being replaced. And what KC has found, that particularly in the areas of diplomatic, military, constitutional history, that there are very few professors being hired in those areas. Now, he quite rightly points out, and ACTA agrees, that bringing in social historians, women's historians, other more diverse historians is absolutely right, and that has enriched the study of history. But in doing so, for better or for worse, it seems to have pushed out others. And I think, again, these are the kinds of consequences that we need to be worrying about and that institutions internally can be examining so that when they prepare to hire, rather than hiring the seventh labor historian, perhaps they can hire a military historian or a diplomatic historian.
There and then over here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. And I have a question maybe I'll just ask to both of you and let you guys take a shot at it. And it maybe is a couple of questions. One of them primarily begins with the idea, and I'm just curious myself, and I think the question needs to be asked, if neutrality is even desirable. Because one of the things I fear as an educator is the idea that there's this quest, or even this notion that neutrality is possible in a classroom. And as an educator, my concern would be if in a quest to be neutral and to create balance, we'd give credence to some viewpoints that have no founding in academia. Should we give credence to the idea that the Holocaust never happened and spend equal time on that? Should we give credence to the idea that that the global warming is not happening and spend equal time on that for the purpose of your desire, Mrs. Neal, to find some kind of neutrality and balance ideas between conservative views and liberal views?
Is not
The
what I
second,
use.
the second part, excuse me, the second part, or the part I guess I would lead to, is what I fear again, and maybe both would comment on this, is the idea that this quest for neutrality would then lead to some kind of moral or ethical apathy, and that as these students leave the higher academic or higher learning, that they're going to go out into the world unable to commit and make any kind of a commitment or make any kind of contributions in society because they've been reduced to such relative perspective.
Ann, you want to start?
Sure. Neutrality is not a term I used. And in fact, I think you and I are in agreement that professors should teach according to accepted scholarly standards. And that does not mean one idea gets balanced with another if they are not equally balanced according to accepted scholarly standards. For instance, Holocaust denial, flat earth, there's no reason to teach those. They're not accepted in scholarly standards. So I don't think we're in disagreement there. I think that, and even David Hollinger of the AUP has talked about what does balance mean, and he describes it as teaching fairly according to scholarly standards. And again, I actually carry the 1915 statement with me wherever I go. And I just want to refer back to this because this to me is what it all means. The university teacher, in giving instructions upon controversial matters, while he is under no obligation to hide his own opinion, should be a person of fair and judicial mind and should set forth justly divergent opinions of other investigators, cause his students to become familiar with the best published expressions of the great historic doctrine, types of doctrine upon the questions at issue. And I think that is really the scholar's obligation, and that's all that ACTA is asking for. And in terms of the ethical commitment of students, again, I think the reason this issue is so important is that a quality education prepares all of us to be informed citizens, effective workers, lifelong learners, and presumably will help inform us for that moral and ethical engagement that we need to have.
Roger?
One reason the 1915 statement warns us against tyranny, the potential tyranny of public opinion. Reminded recently with the New York Times editorial that pointed out that 67% of all Americans who voted Republican in 2004, 67% believe that evolution is wrong. Now, why is that significant? If there is an appeal to the broader public that greater balance is needed in the academy, that public is already biased in a particular way. They're not an informed public. The AAUP survey that Harvard University sociologist Neil Gross carried out, sponsored and funded by the Spencer Foundation, that came out this last year, warned us that the public support for academic freedom is very thin. Public says that if you are a communist or pro-Muslim, you should not be allowed to keep tenure. If you say such things in the classroom, you should not be allowed to keep it. We also know from the same survey, we did the demographics, that the elderly, those with low levels of higher education, those who self-identify as conservative, and those who vote Republican have a very low regard for the professoriate. Now, this is not an issue of naming or pointing the finger or I don't like conservatives. This is the political reality that we face in this country. And to appeal, as say President Bush did, you may recall it, and he said it publicly, I think alongside evolution we ought to be teaching intelligent design. And then the poll survey, Pew did a recent survey based on that question, majority of Americans feel that President Bush is right. That's their notion of balance.
That
and I'm
must be
saying,
the
well, wait a
only
minute.
thing they think he's
In
right
the
on.
scholarly field, an evolutionary biologist should be making the judgment.
And Roger, I've never said anything.
I know I'm
that
not
would
saying you
suggest
didn't,
otherwise.
Ann, but
Yeah.
I'm saying the question is a very important one. But there's a political, social context in which that has to be answered. Finally, I mean, to suggest that Holocaust denial is somehow neutral, it's not. It's making a judgment. It's making an anti-historical judgment. There's nothing neutral about taking that position. In the same way, when President Bush says intelligent design ought to be taught alongside evolution, that's not neutral. That's called appealing to the base. And it's a political move. But the academy, while we try to be free of politics, knows we work within that. With regarding the ethical issue, I refer you to the AAUP webpage where I think the single best statement on professional ethics for the professoriate is the one that we designed and published years and years ago, and it's available for anyone who wishes to see it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't have anything really earth-shattering to say, except that for purposes of trying to complete a graduate study proposal, I am investigating the possibility of looking into asking professors, administration, why Western civilization, the course Western civilization isn't a required course of all students in the core education curriculum. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, have either of you addressed the issue of kind of growing competition on college campuses these days? I earned my first degree during the 70s, and I can honestly say that the level of competition amongst students has definitely increased these days since I've returned to college. And I know one of the reasons is definitely because of the growing number of grades that you can get with the A minuses and B pluses and that sort of thing. Now, the second speaker I know addressed that a little bit. You had mentioned at University of Tennessee and professors not requiring grades on projects or whatever. And then you also mentioned Colorado. I don't know if you were talking about Boulder, but I'd be interested to hear about competition and some success stories at colleges.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great question. And in terms of Western civilization, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni believes that having Western civilization as a required course in a general education program is an excellent idea. We all are of a Western civilization in the United States, and we think it makes sense to know that. But we also thinks that it makes sense to have Eastern civilizations and a diverse introduction to broad areas of knowledge that are important for informed citizenship. We were quite heartened by the most recent Harvard curricular report. It is only in its nascent stage, but one of the things that it requires is a study of American history and institutions. And again, we think this is excellent because to understand ourselves we think is important, even in a global society, also to understand other societies. But we do think it's important to start there, and Harry Lewis makes this point very prominently in his book, Excellence Without a Soul. Now, our ultimate request, however, is not that boards and institutions have to do this, but that they examine and consciously create a gen ed framework. Are there other examples? Yes, the State University of New York, which I mentioned, adopted Western civilization and American history requirements. George Mason has done so. Virginia Tech has done so. The City University of New York has done an overview of a vision statement which would envision it, but has not yet implemented it. So there are other institutions that are doing that now. And grade inflation, again, is an issue that we've addressed. There have been studies which essentially suggest that grade inflation is a problem across the United States. And as I say, CU is going to take a look at that and try to address it. Other institutions already have. Princeton actually imposed certain percentages could receive certain grades, so that they actually have limited number of A's and A minuses in the first and second years. What Dartmouth, and I don't know, I think, yes, we have one Dartmouth alum I know at least in here. Dartmouth, as I understand it, has put on its transcripts what the median grade in the class is, so that businesses or whatever who are hiring can get some sense whether or not 99.9% got an A or not. And I think, again, that's one step to sort of try to inform employers what's happening. I think it does not address the more fundamental issue of integrity to the grading process and the importance of imparting to students a genuine understanding of whether they're doing a good job, whether they're doing a mediocre job, or an excellent job. And I think when we see across the board inflated grades, that does our students a disservice, and that they are not really seeing reflected how they are doing vis-a-vis others.
Let's get another question.
Oh, that's okay, thanks.
I wanted some input on the difference between the idea of opinion and controversy. It seems to me that an awful lot of professorial interest in the humanities and social sciences is based on opinion, and that people have spent a great deal of time doing research that then backs up that opinion, and that's what gets taught in the classroom. That's what these people have studied. And to demand immediately another controversial opinion or create a controversy where there may not be much of one and then demand accountability for that, I think blurs the line a great deal already in a society that is having a more and more difficult time telling the difference between fabricated controversy and where there's genuine controversy. And it seems to me that the unique and wonderful thing about higher education is that gray area where there's genuine discourse as to how we came to the different conclusions, and that needs to be taught before people even get to college.
Roger?
I think one reason that peer review is so important is that faculty within the field can make the judgment on whether or not it is mere opinion or it is informed thinking based on careful research. That is our check, and I think the highest form of accountability within the academy. And one reason that administrators always say to faculty, we want you to be a wonderful teacher, but in order to be a wonderful teacher, you've got to do research. You have to be up in your field. And this is a tip of the hat to ACTA, right. In the classroom, if you do your research, you are well acquainted with competing views on controversial issues and able to treat the issue with the respect it deserves. That is, it's not a simple idea. There is opinion A, there's opinion B, C, D, and E, and you bring those to bear, and then you challenge the student. You tell me which one is most persuasive. I think the best faculty are the ones who do their homework, know the competing views, can present those in an articulate way in the classroom, and then engage the students to come back and make sense of these competing views. Now, somewhere along the way, and this does happen, a faculty member may very well reveal, if it's political science, history, or whatever, what their particular view is on this controversial issue. And some students will find that off-putting. ACTA, I'm sure, would prefer it not happen. And many faculty are extremely skillful. They can hide their views, and the students never figure out where the faculty member is really coming from. But not all of us are that skillful. And it's hard to do. But of course, it depends on the issue.
Yeah, and we don't disagree. I think it's natural for professors to outline their views, and as long as they're staying on topic and it relates to the class in which they're responsible for teaching, that they should do so. And I think, one case comes to mind. Arthur Schlesinger, if he's going to be discussing Jackson, you can be sure he's going to have a perspective. And he's going to tell you that perspective, and by golly, that's why you enrolled in his class, because you want to hear his perspective. And I think the only thing we would then say is we hope, and I think he was very good at doing this, so we hope that the reading list will show that maybe not everyone agreed on the Schlesinger approach to Jackson, that there may have been other scholarship related to Jackson that came out a different way. So I think we're in agreement that, of course, professors who have spent their entire life focusing on a topic, they're going to have a perspective. If they haven't come up with one, it makes you wonder what they've been doing. So we would expect to have a perspective, but we want to make certain that the fact that they have a defined perspective does not then keep the student from learning that there are other ones that may also be legitimate, that they should weigh as they analyze the subject at hand.
Over here and then back over there.
Excuse me, this comment is addressed to Ms. Neal, Mrs. Neal. It seems to me you're arguing that you're here to represent the interests of those people outside the academy who have a vested interest in public education, trustees who represent taxpayers, students, parents, and so forth. Yet if we live in a society that lets the marketplace be the ultimate judge of what's valuable or not, it seems that there are already several mechanisms in place for those people with an interest in higher education to make their voice known. In public media, writing letters to the editor. B, whether or not they send students to universities. And I think we'd all agree that enrollment is escalating throughout the country. People aren't fleeing away from certain universities because of a rampant problem with academic freedom at the universities. And personally, I've lived in the last 6 years in 3 university towns, Tucson, Arizona, Lawrence, Kansas, and here. And there has not been any kind of public uproar over biased professors or unfair treatment to any kind of degree that you seem to insinuate that there is. And instead, those enrollments just grow and grow and grow. People are fighting to get into these schools. And I just don't understand, if it's such a major problem that you seem to claim, why are we not seeing those kinds of reactions in the public, general public?
Ann?
I think that obviously ACTA believes that these are important issues to raise and to raise public awareness, and then it's up for the public to decide. I do think that in terms of a marketplace, I mean, we are beginning to see for-profits, other private institutions come into play, but I'm not sure that it is a vigorous marketplace in terms of going to college. So I agree with you. There may be some that don't perceive to be a problem. There may be some who don't perceive a problem because they don't know about it. And I think ACTA views it as an opportunity to simply raise these issues for public discussion.
Jim?
This is a question to both speakers. Throughout the discussion, there's been a presumption that we're in talking about whether standards should be internal or whether they can come from outside the university, that we're talking about tenured positions, that is, people who have an application of consistent standards with or within or without the university. And I've been retired for some years, so I'm not up on all the statistics, but the last statistics I heard was that something like about 50% of the college teachers in the United States are now adjuncts. And what that means is that there are, at least what it meant when I was a teacher, is that there are no consistent standards to be applied to them at all, whether it's within or without. And so they, in a sense, they fall outside of this discussion. We're really talking about a kind of elite, full-time tenured faculty who are shrinking all of the time. So I'd like to know what your observations are in terms of adjunct faculty.
I really thank you for making that point. It may be the single most valuable point I've heard tonight from myself and or anyone in the audience. AAUP released a major report. It is available on the website in November, Contingent Faculty Index. We call contingent faculty any faculty member, part-time or full-time, if they're not on a tenurable position, not on a tenure track. A lot of postdocs, for example. Our figures, and nobody's questioned our data, and this is based on a national survey, is that 2 out of every 3 faculty today are in a non-tenure track position. They are contingent faculty. And by contingent, we use that term on purpose, they are contingent labor, contingent on enrollment, contingent upon funding. In other words, they do not enjoy the academic freedom that we're discussing. And we link tenure with academic freedom. Only those who are tenured have the kind of freedom we're discussing. So your point's an excellent one. It is a trend of the academy, and it does refer, earlier term used, to the growing marketization, and this is Derek Bach's term, commercialization of the academy. We call it commodification or the corporatization of the academy, but it's greater reliance on part-time faculty so that administrators can show a good bottom line, not run into a deficit at a time when state funding and federal funding is down and philanthropic giving might not be so great, even when student enrollment's going up. So how do you balance the budget in hard fiscal times? You rely on more contingent faculty, you eliminate full-time lines, and in the process, slowly undermine tenure and academic freedom. As far as I know, and this sounds incredibly self-serving, the AAUP is the only organization nationally that is waving the red flag and pulling the alarm bell about the danger. It's a long-term danger. In 1979, 50% of all faculty were contingent. Today that figure is 65%, 2/3. Now the trend line is, given the rapidity of the change, in another 10 to 15 years, 20% of all faculty will probably be tenurable or have tenure. That's 80% contingent. We call them road warriors today. You know the faculty as well as I do. In my area in New York, I knew faculty who were teaching at 5 different colleges. They were constantly on the road, and in order to put together an income at $3,000 to $5,000 a course, depending on their experience, they had to teach at that many schools. And they were making maybe $45,000, $50,000 a year with no benefits. College, you saved a lot of money by not having to pay benefits. So that's the reality today with the professoriate, and you're absolutely right. Our discussion is premised on the old assumptions, and those have changed. And I appreciate your contribution.
Our discussion then pertains to about 20% of the college teaching faculty in the state.
20%?
That's where it's going.
That's the trend line, yeah. That's
Ann, do
right.
you have a comment?
I'm going to pretty much to let Roger be the answer on this one. I think adjunct professors deserve academic freedom.
Very likely.
They deserve academic freedom just as do tenured professors.
Well, I think we'll have one more question, and then we'll have to give our panelists some rest. So,
Okay, I just have a question and a comment, and that is that I was a little dismayed at this discussion that I think, Dr. Bowen, you've engaged in a category of, as Ann says, attacking the messenger. And I think you just didn't attack the messenger. You tarred and feathered the messenger. And I would rather have had the debate focus on more of the key issues than that. And I think it's unfortunate that you began, in my point of view, by politicizing it, by categorizing ACTA as one, conservative, and secondly, very rich as far as their coffers go. I don't know about the either.
His budget's a lot bigger than mine.
Well, it probably is. I do not know about the coffers of ACTA, but I think it's a red herring, because in the same grounds, Carnegie is hardly poor. But on the other hand, we're not going to condemn the initiatives that they have taken in higher education by doing that. So I would rather just focus on the issue, and let me, as a historian, make one point, and I will be very brief because it is very late. And that is, I'm a little dismayed by your assumption that because ACTA has come out supporting the teaching of U.S. history, that is somehow a lack of diversity within the curriculum. I'm amazed at this because, as you know, it was hardly a Republican. It was Senator Byrd who pushed the teaching of U.S. history in the high schools. It is hardly a conservative organization, the American Historical Association, who laments the knowledge of American history teaching at the university level. So on those are my briefest comments.
Could I comment?
Yes.
Yeah. I encourage you to read, if you've not already read, ACTA's report, How Many Were Churchills, where they do an unscientific, that's their words, not mine, study of syllabi and course descriptions, and look at their characterizations if we want to talk about red herrings. And what becomes apparent, and ACTA report says this, is way too much coursework today done by faculty on touchy-feely issues.
We don't say that, Roger.
I know you don't use that language, but I encourage you to read the report. But this is my
have.
characterization. But they do decry courses on social justice, racial
Wrong,
justice.
Roger.
Go through it, environmental justice, and they say that justice is a code word. Now, that's the ACTA report. My judgment is, and Ann referred to the State University of New York, emphasizing Western civilization curriculum, but they did so. The trustees imposed it, and they got a vote of no confidence from 200,000 faculty across the SUNY system. Why? The faculty weren't, I don't believe, I was not faculty, so I don't know, the faculty were not upset that the trustees wanted Western civilization taught across all SUNY institutions. What upset them is that the trustees, non-academics, were setting the curriculum. Basic tenet of academic freedom is that faculty alone decide what curriculum will be taught. If trustees began dictating American history, what's to prevent them next time saying, well, gosh, you know, I missed the Cold War. Let's have a course on Soviet history. You know, faculty should be making that judgment after an internal debate among the faculty, a curriculum review committee, and come up with a decision, all right, are we offering enough courses in American history? Of course, every college in the country ought to be offering U.S. history. I hope I didn't give you the impression that I was opposed to U.S. history being taught. What I'm opposed to is trustees telling faculty they have to teach it, or rather than faculty making that judgment for themselves.
Anne?
Well, the reality is the faculty won't make that judgment necessarily for themselves. And I think the question is, who is to speak for the students' need for a quality education? Let's say smaller classes, or actual professors in the classroom, or professors teaching what students need to learn instead of the topic that the professor happens to be researching. I think that the SUNY board, the George Mason board, worked a process with the faculty, and they concluded that it was important for their students to know American history. I think that's a benefit for students. I think it's a benefit for our citizens, and I hope more boards will do that.
Let me agree with Ann on something. If the board, governing boards, work with the faculty,
That's what we always say.
work with the faculty, rather than do what the SUNY board did, we think it's a good idea that Western civilization be required of all students who graduate. That's where they get into trouble. Shared governance works better than top-down, authoritarian kind of rule. We're not, the academy doesn't want to go in that direction, faculty don't want that, and I think boards and administrators need to be sensitive to that. So work together, yes, we're in agreement.
But
Can we
this
end on
is,
that positive note?
This is one of those instances where it's top-down. Let's thank our panelists for a wonderful evening. And thank you all for being here tonight.